Hello, Jessica Bockler here from the Alef Trust, and today I'm in conversation with Dr. Regina Hess. Regina is a clinical and transpersonal psychologist and a body-centered Gestalt psychotherapist from Germany. And she's joining the Alef Trust this year, delivering a new course, which I'm very excited about personally, exploring the nature of trauma, the multidimensionality of trauma and its transformation. And just to frame our conversation, I want to say a few words. So trauma transformation to me really, and also collective healing, feel like one of the most pressing concerns of our time. If you look at the past and the present of the human species, it's filled with war, with conflict and violence. And in the 20th century alone, humans committed atrocities on unprecedented scales. And today, with the rise of new forms of nationalism and authoritarianism, we're really facing rising global turmoil, whilst our instruments of collective action, like the UN Security Council, for example, or our instruments of collective accountability, really seem paralyzed or seem ignored by many countries and their leaders. And additionally, as a species, we seem very dissociated from our deeper human nature, which is rooted in nature at large. As humans, we're part of the wider ecosystems of Earth. Our body is an extension of the Earth body, and we're made from the Earth. Yet our behavior and our collective systems that we have evolved, conquering nature and commodifying nature, really suggest that we have failed to understand our deeper being. And this really with devastating consequences. So, Regina, I'd like to put some questions to you to explore the nature of trauma and its transformation, how we should engage with these huge challenges that lie before us. And perhaps we could start with the individual healing journey and what pathways and resources can help us to heal individually.
First of all, Jessica, thank you very much for this invitation and this opportunity to discuss some content of this course. I'm very much looking forward to work with Alef Trust and the students now. Regarding your question of individual trauma, first of all, it's very difficult to talk about trauma in general because trauma can be so different. There are so many impact variables that can be so different. So, for example, the severity of the trauma, the impact of the trauma, of course, in what age it happened, or if there are several occasions, and what are the reactions on a psychological and physical level, what kind of violence experience was it, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So it's very difficult on the one hand to talk in general about it. So all these factors would be screened in clinical interviews, in clinical diagnostic beforehand, and also to see, of course, the stability of the personality structure will be kind of the key to how we can work in individual therapy, but also, of course, will be a key for the prognosis of the potential of healing and transformation. For example, the resiliency is a strong impact factor. If there was, for example, beforehand already an experience that this person was able to resolve to some extent a feeling of empowerment. If I have an adversity experience, I'm able to manage, or I have factors that can help me. So that's usually very good prognosis. Or on the other hand, if not, if there is adverse experience and it just comes on top of another adverse experience, usually that's called vulnerability or risk factors. So if people already are traumatized, and usually this is then early childhood trauma. If later trauma builds on early childhood trauma, the risk factors are just much higher. But again, it will depend on resiliency factors, how people were able to manage. That would be like a short answer on the diagnostic side. Then on the therapeutic side, of course, first of all, we will have a long period of developing a therapeutic client relationship to really build a safe relationship. That's the most important thing after trauma. There needs to be a safe space that the client can learn to open up, and there needs to be a very strong, safe relationship in the therapy. And then the first step will be more like diagnostic anamnesis and practical tools for stabilization. So at least before I start any kind of deeper work, I will always teach some simple body techniques for relaxation, some techniques for grounding, especially very important, because the biggest issue is dissociation in trauma. So when the client will dissociate, like from certain triggers of the trauma, so they go back to the past triggered by this experience. And of course in dissociation, no transformation or healing is possible. So what I always say in the very beginning, our core work is to work on dissociation, how you can learn other possibilities in order to be able to heal, because the dissociation reaction will keep you stagnated in the trauma experience.
Yes, and as I'm listening to you speaking there, for me what surfaces is this sense of this frozenness, that things are stuck in the body, frozen in the body-mind, spirit, the whole of us, energy caught up and frozen in a past moment. Could you speak a little more to that and how you work with the body in releasing that energy?
Yeah, means there are the two extreme emergency reactions. That would be the freeze. I freeze, I go numb, I cannot feel anything anymore in order to survive, especially to feel not the emotions are happening. And the other reaction would be the flight, being hyper aroused all the time, like always in a position of on the run. I need to be able to run if something happens. And in both states, we cannot be in the present moment. So it's basically this window between the two where only healing or transformation can be possible. So really, there's a lot of work on analyzing triggers of trauma that the client can learn, or these are certain triggers that will trigger me, and what practices usually the client needs to find themselves what really works easily. So usually I offer a broad scale of relaxation techniques for the body, grounding exercises to be able to move. I work a lot with movement because usually movement helps to come out of this kind of shock state. And I work a lot with creative practices, but also creative practices you easily go very deep very quickly. So again, it can lead to dissociation. So it's more like, I call it a dance with dissociation. And around this dance, it's not like that we just can get rid of this or just heal or transform it, but more like live with this state of dissociation and try to reduce it as much as possible.
That really resonates with me. I come from the background in performing arts and working with creative arts in mental health contexts, and so often there is this discernment of what creative tool might be best used or what creative practice might be best used in a particular situation with a group or an individual. And as you say, these practices can also go very deep and can lead people to re-traumatize, right? Or to become too exposed to material that goes very deep and can set them, can cause anxiety. So for me, there's something there about this playful dipping the toes in, being in the present moment, gently playing with a kind of self-compassionate stance. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in that way, so the dance works very well, the metaphor of a dance, that we dance around the trauma and dance around the dissociation, or we dance with the dissociation. And in that way, every session also has these certain parts. First, like a update, a warm up, a grounding in the first place, some little breathing movement exercises, then working deeper on some content of the trauma and the dissociation, and then bringing the client back again into stabilization and some movement and so forth. So in that way, it develops kind of a circle in itself, like a healing circle has every session.
Yeah, thank you.
And so from the material that I use, means I'm a traditional Gestalt worker, so it's always like working, closing the Gestalt, finding finding closing circles, which helps a lot as a metaphor in the trauma work also. And I draw a lot on narrative therapy, which really shows very strong results. Even, for example, before veterans in the US, they have very good results working with narrative therapy by giving voice to the trauma, what has happened, or for example, what did I do? The feeling of guilt and shame, voicing that and having a witness in a safe container. So I can really confirm that a lot in all kinds of shades of trauma, that expressing the trauma and having a good professional witness can have really power of healing. That's kind of the one side, and then a lot of body memory work, how to transform body memory, or finding good places and difficult places in the body, how to balance this out, and always the foundation of mindfulness and compassion. There's also a lot of research confirming the impact of these factors, mindful-based stress reduction, for example, and the use of compassion as like a heart opening. I can also confirm that, really feel this is a strong, a good prognosis once the client can reconnect with a feeling of joy in the heart, or feeling of, oh, I feel happiness, I feel love, and to be able to build that again.
And this telling of stories that you were speaking about, I imagine it's not only verbal, but it can also be an embodied storytelling.
Yeah. I work a lot with performance, also with psychodrama, body-oriented psychodrama. I use mantra singing a lot, because often the voicing is so blocked that it's not possible to say any word, or it's not possible to sing. But I found out that with mantras, just some syllables or just humming something can help open up this blockage in the throat, not to express, to hold back. And this holding back usually is like a really severe blockage of actually not accepting themselves, their trauma. So because the first step for healing, for any possibility of transformation, is to accept what has happened. But first of all, to myself, not to anybody, but that I accept, yes, this is what has happened. This is my truth. And then take responsibility. I want to come out of this. I don't want to live like this anymore. So I focus very much on acceptance. There's also behavioral approaches, acceptance commitment therapy. I really like these parts of this behavioral approach, to say, okay, first of all, I need to help you to accept what has happened to you, and then to take commitment and responsibility in order that you can learn how to transform.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if you could also touch a little on the more collective, the transgenerational nature of trauma. We've covered the individual, but of course the individual doesn't live in isolation, but is part of the larger story, the transgenerational story, and part of the larger body, as I was saying earlier on, the body of Earth.
Yeah, means I'm 20 years clinical psychologist. I'm 10 years specialized, solely working in trauma specialized approaches, individual, systemic, collective. So what happened means I'm from Germany, so all my life I was confronted on working with war trauma, working on, transformation of war trauma, second, first world war experiences. And so I developed constellation work, specific constellation work for working with historic and collective experiences. I also integrate in the same way then body work, psychodrama, performative sciences approaches, narrative approaches. And I really can see amazing results, because I worked quite a long time in psychiatry, and we always had, of course, combination of individual and group therapy. And then in group therapy, first of all, of course, the power of sharing and hearing, okay, I'm not the only one having this experience, but also really connecting on a collective level of, yes, this is what my parents experienced. This is what my grandparents experienced. Yes, they had actually post-traumatic stress symptoms, but of course they were not diagnosed with something like that. Yeah? So that's a huge topic, and also what we see, of course, and there's a lot of research in sexual trauma, that it's usually also repetitive and already passed on over transgenerational lineages. So this is all my clinical work. It's really a huge topic, and since I specialize more in transpersonal approaches, I always include this bigger picture of working in an ancestral picture. not only on trauma, but also on potential. What strengths did we get from our ancestors? What values, positive values, do we learn from our ancestors? Also, it's very empowering. And since then, I really see a shift to the solely clinical approach, which is usually only focusing on the symptoms, only focusing on this individual story. Sometimes there's a systemic emphasis to look in the family. What does this person do to the family, which is great and also important, but we cannot stop there. I really see the power once the client can connect the dots even much further beyond one family to the collective, even to connect it to historical lineages. And then the ecological dimensions naturally comes in. Naturally, usually the client themselves arrive, but then I need to look also at nature, so the bigger picture naturally flows in such a way. And since I work like this, I see much more transformation possible for clients.
It feels like we're tapping not only into our own stories, but into the larger stories of the earth, and seeing through those practices, seeing the larger patterns that are reverberating through the generations and collectively, and the patterns that we're immersed in right now. Yes, as we're living at this time and day, these patterns that are still alive, that are still, even though, I mean, the Second World War feels like a longer time ago now, but nonetheless, the pain from that time and all the suffering of all the genocides that have happened, that suffering is unresolved still. So much of it is unrecognized, unseen, repressed, and it's still expressing itself on so many levels, in families, in collective dynamics. So it feels so important to address this piece.
Yeah,
and
absolutely, yeah.
in fact, it feels like one of the major challenges of our time, really, in order to facilitate a shift in human consciousness.
I think so. Really, we cannot, and this is really kind of what I'm really teaching right now. We cannot stop at the individual level. Of course, when a client is in acute symptomatics, of course we need to stabilize and do all the work. This is not what I mean, but we cannot stop there. On a general population, not only on the level of clinical treatment or clinical diagnosis, but on a level of consciousness of a general population. And what I really learned from that trauma, when I boil it down, I come to the level of nature, because I would say right nowadays, I would say, okay, our first primal trauma starts when we started dissociating from nature, in the, moving into the development of our times. We can go through the history to see where we started, splitting more and more of the level of connectedness with nature, learning with nature, living in a cyclical form, how nature develops with all its ups and downs. And so basically I feel like, okay, it's really this split of human nature from nature is the core trauma that we all carry in modern times. And from this we can develop all the individual little bits and stories, but at the end, bottom line, is not so much different.
Yeah. It makes me think of all the natural disasters that are occurring right now. The fires in Australia, the major storms that we have seen. It also now makes me think of your story and the experiences that you have had in terms of natural disaster and going through that, and how we can tend to again dissociate and say that's something happening in nature, it's nothing to do with us, when really the inner and the outer are well, we're part of the larger earth body. I'm wondering whether you could speak a little bit about your personal story, the experience that you have gone through that I just alluded to there, in order to shine a deeper light into that deeper connection to the ecological body.
Yes, this was absolutely a turning point in my life. 2004, I survived the tsunami in Thailand. I was I was living on the beach, and I was just immediately in the wave, and could not come up anymore, could not breathe. So I had a full-blown near-death experience, a very deep spiritual oneness experience on the one hand, then like a miracle being thrown back onto land, and then confronted with the devastation of land and death toll of people. So that was definitely huge. That was a turning point in my life, to the good. Means I was always spiritual. I worked in a clinical mainstream psychiatric hospital, always already pretty at the edge to focus on collective healing and so forth. But after the tsunami, this realization came: we are dissociated from nature. Because actually what the experience that I had in the tsunami was that in this oneness experience, I felt connected with the earth, with all elements. I felt connected with the power of the tsunami. And this stays, it never left my body. It is really there. And since then, of course, I did my PhD in transpersonal psychology in USA because of this experience that I really felt, okay, now I really need to work in a transpersonal framework and to support, the trauma healing on such an expanded level. And since then, this is my love, my work, this is my life's calling, to do trauma work in such an expanded way.
Mm-hmm. It's very moving to hear you speak about that experience.
It took me a long time, to like 10 years I did, for several years I did therapy, and since 10 years I did like a research study on my own experience, a case study. And since after 10 years it feels like it's really good, it's really settled and integrated. I've published articles on it, so maybe you can look it up. It's really good for me to talk about it, and it's part of my teaching, because I think when I talk through this experience and that the students can understand why I teach in that way and what it really means.
Yeah. It also feels like there are two complementary ways of working that are coming together and meeting here, and they're concerned with, on the one hand, the clinical work, the trauma transformation work, and then on the other hand, a kind of activism that, a kind of working in the political sphere, in the communal sphere, in order to facilitate changes and shifts that we need so much today.
Yeah, that would lead to another development in my work. So after the tsunami, I started with my PhD, I started studying very detailed about near-death experiences and research on near-death experiences. That helped me also a lot to work, and since then I have many clients with near-death experiences. But what was stunning for me when I studied about near-death experience, that it was compared very much to psychedelic experiences and to working with dreams. And I work all my life, I am a Jungian scholar, I work all my life with depth psychological dream analysis. So that was stunning on the first place. I thought, oh, that's my work anyways. With psychedelic science at that time, I had no experience. I was always just yoga, meditation, dance, and so forth. And then, but I thought, oh, I'm really interested. And then I really started since 2006, since my PhD, really specializing on a clinical level, on a systematically studying the approaches in psychedelic science on the clinical side and in the indigenous side. But overall, what I would say, why I'm really interested also integrating psychedelic science, both indigenous and modern approaches, because again, it connects to our dissociation from nature, because working with altered states is a part of our culture since humanity exists. So again, this also connects to a cultural approach to treatment and transformation, but also it connects to this activism, what you just mentioned, to really, so what I really teach is more like a general approach that it is a part of humanity to work with altered states, with or without substances. It's a cultural approach that we have indigenous approaches working with medicine work, which they call medicine work, or modern approaches now also related to trauma. I just would like to mention, of course, the groundbreaking treatment results with MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. So of course I'm on top of all this work, and it comes all together. But when I boil it down, I would say it is really our trauma, is our dissociation from nature. Mm-hmm. And everything what I teach is connected to that.
It's great that you're mentioning this, the psychedelic renaissance, and it's wonderful to see more research being done again in this area. In the UK, there's a lot happening. It's exciting. And it's also, for me, connected to giving ourselves permission again to be utilizing these broader, wider, more expanded states of consciousness, and to be working in playful ways, accessing trance states effectively in order to reframe and rephrase our individual story, but also our collective stories, kind of like a restorying of what we're about as a human species in relation to the wider planet.
Exactly, absolutely. So, you know, in that way, it's like, it feels like I start on this level and then I go to like an ecological, cosmological level, and suddenly everything that I ever once did in my life comes together now, you know. So I feel like it's an integration of trauma, what I present in the course, you know.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Regina, for exploring this topic with me, which is very rich, and we could go on further. There's so much depth to it, and as you said, so many different ways to approach it. And well, overall, I'm making this movement because it feels like we need this kind of integrated approach towards this topic, and that is grounded in the whole. Not isolating the individual, but really realizing we're part of a much larger body and a much larger story. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm very much looking forward to your team and to the students especially.
It's great to have you on board.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. And just to say to all of you, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please feel free to have a look at the Alef Trust website. You'll see our course offer there. And if you're interested in any of the courses that we run, then please do get in touch. Thank you all.